Who murdered Jack and Louise Hathcock's adopted daughter, Susan Jones? Was it for the state line properties, as many people have been led to believe? Sit back and listen. Welcome back to BUFORD PUSSER, the other story. Today we're here to discuss the story of Susan Anderson Hathcock Jones. Kind of a confusing name. Maybe one that you've never heard of, but we're going to see if we can help you with that today. You see, Jack and Louise never had a child of their own. Louise always wanted one, but for some reason that's unknown to me, she never had one. Now, she had a brother, Bill Anderson, who was married to a young lady named May. Now, they had a child, Jeanette Susan Anderson. The problem was that shortly after giving birth, May passed away due to complications. Bill was young. He was a truck driver. He had no idea how to take care of an infant. He was in a little bit of a panic. How was he to do this? What was he to do? How was he going to do it when he was out on the road? It was all so confusing to him. Well, fortunately for him, Louise saw this as an opportunity to raise a child and volunteered to adopt Jeanette Susan. Things went well. She was close to both of them, but especially close to Jack. Jack was everything to her. Louise, as much as she wanted a child, I don't think she was really fit for everything that motherhood might bring. Now, when Susan was a young child, she grew up at both the Shamrock, mostly there in the motel office, and also at their home on Proper Street in Corinth. Now, when she was there at the Shamrock, she often got to play with her neighbor, Dennis Hathcock, who lived right across the street at the Plantation Club with W.O. and Louise Hathcock. Now, they would come over, visit each other. They kind of grew up together, so they got to know each other. But there weren't very many kids around in the area, so Susan was really pleased when her cousin, Barbara Anderson, started to visit more often. And, during times of the year, she would live there at the Shamrock in rooms number 2 or 3 with different relatives. At any rate, Barbara and Susan became best friends. Not just cousins, but they were best friends, almost inseparable. And it was that way for years. As you know, Barbara Anderson told me all about what happened at the Shamrock when she was there. It's interesting stories to hear from her. But it was different when you grew up at the Shamrock or at the state line, because you tended to grow up fast. And Susan did exactly that. When she was 15 years old or so, she fell in love with one of the employees there, a young man named Raymond Jones. Now, everybody called him Okie Dokie. And the reason for that was because whenever somebody would tell him to do something, he'd say, Okie Dokie. At any rate, some people thought that Raymond had kind of a loose screw, that he wasn't quite like most people. But for whatever reason, Susan loved him. So much so that they decided to get married without telling Jack and Louise. Now, it's one of those situations where Raymond went to the wedding, but Susan had a stand-in, another girl, a friend of hers, stood in place for her at the wedding ceremony when vows were exchanged, and it was legal. Now, when it was time for Susan and Raymond to confess to Jack and Louise that they were married, it didn't go well. Jack and Louise both wanted the marriage to be annulled. But, I guess they understood that Susan wasn't going to be happy with that, and they insisted that a proper wedding be done, one where Susan was in attendance when they exchanged vows. So that was arranged, and they were remarried, if you will. Things went well for a while. Jack and Louise provided them with the living quarters. Actually, it was a rent house that was across the street from the Shamrock Motel. Little yellow frame house, kind of cute. And they lived there for some time until Jack decided that they needed better living quarters. So he purchased a home for them in Farmington, which is just northeast of Corinth, kind of a suburb. Now, while the home in Farmington was nice, it was a new subdivision. There were only 3 houses that had been built there so far. So you would think Susan would be happy, but she was a little depressed, and who knows, it could be that here she is, that she, like other young couples, has had a child, Karen, and so her life is involved around a baby. She's no longer around friends and family like she once was, and she became a little unhappy. Raymond spotted this, so he went down to West Point, Mississippi, where her cousin Barbara lived, and asked Barbara's mother if there was any possibility that Barbara could move to Farmington and live with them. So Susan would have someone there with her that would make her feel more comfortable. Well, Barbara's mother reluctantly agreed, just insisting that Barbara finish cosmetology school that she was attending. And, she agreed. So they went back to Corinth, and Barbara moved in. Now, cosmetology school was something that both Susan and Barbara were attending. It wasn't long before they started skipping class, and next thing you know, they had dropped out, and they were living a good life there in Farmington. Now, for whatever reason, even though Susan seemed happy that Barbara was there, she would still have moods where she would want to leave, not tell anybody where she was going. When she'd get back, she may or may not tell people where she had been. And, this really upset Raymond. He didn't feel like that she was being a housewife that he had expected her to be. So he insisted that she change her ways and, she start cooking meals, that she clean the house. Susan had always paid somebody to clean the house. As far as meals, they usually ate out in a restaurant. Susan had quite a bit of money. But this is the interesting part, is that when Jack and Louise had both left this earth, she became the sole heir to the state line properties. The big problem that she had was that the IRS had a lien placed on all the properties because Jack had failed to pay income taxes for several years. The lien was $130,000. That may not seem insurmountable today, but in today's money, that $130,000 from back then would be the equivalent to about $1.3 million now. So, yeah, it was insurmountable. There wasn't much that Susan could do about that. And that may have been part of her troubles, is knowing she had the property, not knowing what to do, not knowing how to pay it off, so on. Well, at any rate, making a long story short, Raymond insisted that she started being more of a housewife. And so she and Barbara went to Giant's, the local grocery store, supermarket, and purchased things for them to fix a meal, like Raymond had requested. So they were fixing chicken, mashed potatoes, and green peas. Well, that night, they sat down at the table to have their meal, And Barbara was watching Karen, their daughter, along with another child that she had agreed to watch for a friend. Well, she was kind of lost focus. She told me that maybe she just had put it aside and could not remember, but she had no idea what they got into an argument about there at the table. First thing you know, Susan threw her cigarette down in the middle of the table, got up, and walked down into the hallway to the bedroom. And Raymond sat there for 30 seconds or so. He got up, followed her toward the bedroom. There's a little dress of Karen's in the hallway. He kicked it aside, went into the bedroom, closed the door, and Barbara heard the click as he engaged the lock on the door. Don't know how long it was, 30 seconds, maybe a minute or two. And suddenly, Barbara hears a gunshot come from the bedroom. And she knew something was wrong. So she grabbed Karen and the infant that she was keeping and headed out the front door. And she was running down the hill to the neighbors. It's a little ways down there. She got tired, so she put Karen down and let her walk from that point, holding hands. Well, when they got there, no one was at home at the neighbor's house. So she circled around back of the houses and went to the neighbor on the other side of their residence, which was a Mr. Box. Knocked on the door. He answered, listened to Barbara, explained what the problems were there, and he agreed to go back to the house with her. Be sure and hit that subscribe button to get notification of new videos as they're released. They walked down to Raymond and Susan's residence, went in, and walked down the hallway. They heard no sounds whatsoever. When Mr. Box reached down and grabbed the doorknob, it wouldn't turn, and he asked Barbara if she had a key to the doors. And, of course, Barbara did. Little Karen was used to going into the bathroom, filling the sink full of water, and playing in it. So it was one of those things where Barbara kept a key just in case that Susan was to ever lock herself in the bathroom, or any room for that matter. Well, she retrieved the key. Mr. Box opened the door, went inside, and found both Susan and Raymond laying on the floor. Susan was at the side of the bed near a window. Raymond was at the foot of the bed, a gun near him. Mr. Box reached down, retrieved the gun, and placed it on the bed. He checked on Susan, knew she was dead, and thought that Raymond was dead as well. They called authorities, and they arrived shortly. Then, when the ambulance attendants got there, they pronounced both dead, but after about 15 minutes, Raymond resumed breathing. So they rushed him to the hospital, and he lived for about 3 hours. He was bubbling blood from his mouth as he went down the hallway past Barbara as they were loading him onto the ambulance. And of course, there were all kinds of questions to be asked, and Barbara told them what that she knew, and authorities insisted that she stay over that night so that she could be there for a coroner's inquest the following day. Fortunately, of all people, Towhead White's mother had Barbara stay with her that night. Now, Barbara met with the coroner for the inquest the next day, answered all of his questions. She had answered all of the authorities' questions, and eventually it was ruled a murder-suicide. Now, one thing that was learned through the investigation is that Raymond had cut the telephone lines to the house. He had also gone out to the car and loosened the distributor cap on the vehicle so it would not start. He didn't want Susan to be able to contact anyone, didn't want anyone to be able to leave in that vehicle. There were no signs of forced entry, and the reason I mention that is there is an author out there who has written a book that has misled a lot of people who don't know the real story. And his story is that this was all over the state line properties. It was about who could obtain them. And of course, with Susan being the sole heir after the deaths of Jack and Louise, Jack hadn't paid federal income taxes for several years and owed $130,000. So that was a sum of money that Susan simply couldn't pay. And so that was probably part of the reason that she was so unhappy. At any rate, this author wrote that W.O. Hathcock and Howard Bunch, both of Corinth, wanted the state line properties. And they knew that Susan was first in line to get them, and that they had hired a Mississippi law enforcement agent to assassinate them. Now, of course, this is just total fabrication. There's nothing that indicates that that ever happened. It was just the way that this fictional version was written. As it turns out, yes, W.O. and Howard Bunch did get the state line properties, but they did it simply by paying off the lien that Jack owed the IRS, and they took possession of it. Even then, they opened the restaurant, but they never opened the motel. And it was basically a real estate transaction, because the properties were certainly worth far more than the $130,000 that Jack owed the IRS. So that kind of really blew things out of the water as far as fictional accounts go. But, none of this was ever brought up, never mentioned in the story Walking Tall, like so many other things that in the real story were never mentioned. You have to keep in mind that in that movie, and they didn't even use the real names, probably because they were afraid of liability situations had they named anyone. I mean, in the movie, they had Callie Hacker as Louise Hathcock. They had John Witter, who was kind of a composite figure, I guess, of the mob, the politicians in Nashville, everyone else. They didn't name hardly any of the real characters except for the PUSSER family. So there you have it, the life and death of Jack and Louise Hathcock's adopted daughter. We'll be back next Thursday. Another story from the PUSSER files. And then, of course, we'll be back Saturday with a Saturday short. So I hope you join us then. Till then, just remember, the truth has no agenda.